Hello everybody and welcome to Insider's Guide. Today we're discussing the resort at one of the most famous mountain towns in the United States, Park City. Because of the Goliath scale of the resort, this episode is split into 4 parts, with part A providing crucial background information and this part discussing the bulk of the Park City side of the mountain. So with that, let's continue in Insider's Guide to Ski Resorts, Park City. We'll start off over at the top of town and payday. The bulk of this part will be discussing intermediate and advanced terrain in these lower pods, but if you're here for the Jupiter Peak Extremes, jump to the time on screen to skip all this. As discussed previously, Bonanza access is quite flat, but also quite short. To get to anywhere from either of these lifts, you'll need to ride the Bonanza lift. Bonanza services a small pod, along with access from the base area to the rest of the mountain, and as such, it can get some decent lines. However, they're not as bad as one might think, and pale in comparison to some of the other lifts we'll talk about. Within the Bonanza pod, you've got Home Run as the primary green. It starts out as the primary access to all this terrain on both sides, and as such, gets extremely busy on its initial section. Ski with extreme caution, control, and anticipation in this area. Once other runs start splitting off down here, it gets significantly better. Home Run itself switches back to the right, becoming a bit narrower into just a road as it descends down into the pod. It then opens up at a big intersection with lots of choices. If you keep furthest left, you'll stay on Home Run, which stays as a road and gives you access to the base area. The most popular option is to go right into the big, wide, mellow gully, which is the Bonanza Green that takes you directly to the Bonanza lift. If you miss Home Run but want to go to the base area, there is another road on the left side you can take that is shown here. If you miss that, however, you'll be stuck riding Bonanza. From this big intersection above, you can also shoot across to Lower Jonesy's. Jonesy's itself is my favorite run in the pod, and it's a fantastic cruiser, albeit just a touch steep on its first pitch. At that big intersection, you can continue all the way across onto Shortline if you wish to access Pioneer, although I don't recommend this trail because it is ultra flat. The same goes for Flatiron, which comes back from Pioneer. The one benefit of Flatiron is it allows base area access from the Pioneer pod. The Little Kings Park is mostly jumps and boxes, and is pretty short. It isn't as busy as the 3 Kings Parks by the base area, however. Unshown on the trail map are a pair of extremely short blue groomers, named Long Belly and Lil Belly, that get you from Lower Jonesy's to Bonanza. These allow you to cut across to the road here that gets you back to the base area. Below those 2 named trails are a few unnamed and ungroomed roads that can be some fun, short off-piste for intermediates and up. These will not give you access to the base area. If you keep going past where Home Run switches back, and then take a right off the ridge, you'll head down Berg's Bowl, which is a short, steep, semi-treed area that doesn't hold great snow. I don't recommend it. Up where Jonesy's first splits from Home Run, you can also go right onto Mid-Mountain Meadows. This run is quite steep for a blue, and can get icy, but it's not terribly long. As an alternative, you can take Mid-Mountain, which is a pretty tranquil little road that winds through the forest. These will take you down to the Pioneer lift, which we'll come back to in a moment. There is some good lower level tree skiing in and around Mid-Mountain. Just below Jonesy's is Belmont, which isn't often groomed, and Muckers, which is another great blue cruiser. Additionally, there is a popular adventure run called Blaster. This one is frequented by ski school, so there are other adventure runs elsewhere I prefer more. Now, as you head down Home Run, you'll notice half, if not more, traffic turning left instead of right as if going to Bonanza. This is all traffic going to the Silverlode lift. All of it. There's also a lot of traffic going to Silverlode from King Khan and the Quicksilver Gondola, neither of which you can see. All this is to say that, without a doubt, Silverlode sees by far the worst crowds in the whole of Park City. There are a multitude of reasons, so let's start with this one, Claim Jumper. Claim Jumper is pretty much the only main mountain green in all of Park City that isn't a road, doesn't switch back, or do anything like that. And as such, it is exceptionally popular. Unless you're a true beginner, avoid Claim Jumper like the plague. If you are a beginner, I would highly recommend Bonanza as an alternative. If you take Crescent out of the base area, it's easiest to take one of these load runs to Claim Jumper to Silverlode to get higher up, but I would recommend taking this little cut here to Home Run to Bonanza instead. Quarter Load is the widest, while the others are just roads. Additionally, from Silver Queen, you can shoot across and get to Bonanza even though it doesn't look like it on the map, so this is another option. There are lots of ways to avoid Silverlode, but odds are that you'll end up at it at some point during your visit regardless, because a lot of Silverlode's pod is just really good. Simple as that. Something important to note is that the top of Silverlode is set back and up a little bit from these other two, so access to Hidden Splendor and Lost Prospector from Bonanza or Motherlode takes some traversing and a lot of willpower, so I recommend not trying it. Hidden Splendor down through Assessment here are good blue cruisers, although be aware that not all of them are groomed every night. Mel's Alley is a road and isn't signed at a lot of the intersections, so if you want to take it the whole way, go left at all the intersections. Lost Prospector, Newport, and Dynamite are groomed often enough not to be too moguled. Short Fuse and Detonator are both super fun adventure runs, but I much prefer Detonator, as it's somewhat harder to get to, requiring you to find and stick with Mel's Alley. The adventure zones, while individually unique, are all similar in style in that they're basically super narrow roads that have bank turns and whatnot. You won't really need to dodge moguls or trees, but a rock or two in the middle is far from unheard of. Detonator is also much longer than Short Fuse. The main run on the other side of the lift is Parley's Park, which can be accessed by starting down either side of the Motherlode top terminal. If coming off Bonanza, don't waste energy trying to go uphill. Just go to the left of that terminal, and then traverse to your right below the terminal. Since we're talking about difficult access, getting to the Summit House from Silverlode takes quite the skate, and I would instead recommend heading down to the Mid-Mountain Lodge, which we'll discuss later. When coming down Parley's Park, the first left you'll then have access to is Singlejack. Singlejack isn't anything special, and I rarely ski it, but if you want an easy way to get to Thaynes, that's your route. Mikey's, I believe, is groomed about once a week, but don't quote me on that. Motherlode Meadows starts out fairly mild, but don't be fooled. It earns that double black rating in its lower half as you get into these super steep and tight trees. Fool's Gold and Glory Hole are great black mogul runs. After you pass all of these turnoffs, Parley's Park comes to a three-way intersection. If you go right, as most people do, you'll head down Prospector. As far as blacks go, Prospector is one of the easiest you'll find at Park City, as it's not terribly steep. It is, however, quite busy, and icy as a result. If you go to the middle, you'll continue down Parley's Park, from which you will then have another three-way intersection. The left fork at the upper intersection is Sunnyside, another fantastic blue cruiser, although beware it's only groomed every other night. The left fork of the lower fork is Carbide Cut, which is groomed every night. That's the last run you can take to access the Motherlode Express, and I would highly recommend taking it. Motherlode's lines only ever take a fraction of the time as Silverlode's. If you have the choice to take Motherlode, take it. If you keep right at that lower fork, you'll keep on Parley's Park and end up at Silverlode, which just isn't worth it. If you go to the middle, you'll head down my favorite adventure zone, TNT. TNT is super duper long, and just keeps winding back and forth and back again. It's kinda out here, so you're unlikely to see anyone else. My only word of warning is that in its lower section, it has a couple spots that are pretty steep for being so narrow of a run. Everything we just discussed flows into Thaynes Canyon, which is pitched just enough that you typically don't have to walk, but be aware that on powder or slush days, you're not going to have a fun time. If you miss Motherlode, you'll end up all the way down at King Khan. On the same side of the canyon above the Motherlode pod is Thaynes. You can access Thaynes by coming from Pioneer or by taking either Singlejack or Doublejack from the Summit House area. Singlejack is a pretty standard groomer, but be careful not to accidentally continue onto Mikey's. Doublejack is often moguls, although it does get the occasional groom. The other two blacks, Thaynes and Hoist, are some of the best single black mogul runs on the entire Park City side. Thaynes is significantly busier, so I prefer Hoist. Keystone is a nice run for its upper half, but then becomes a road. There are better blues elsewhere, but it's a nice rest lap between the mogul runs. Thaynes is a double, but doesn't seem nearly as bad of lines as Silverlode, typically with weights more similar to Motherlode. It's not terribly slow and not terribly long, but if you're truly anti-fixed grip, you can continue down Thaynes Canyon to Motherlode. This section can be pretty flat in spots, so I typically just take the double. At the top of Thaynes, you can access the Jupiter Access Trail, but it requires some skating uphill. You can't get to Sampson, and to get to these blues, you'll have to sidestep up to a gate directly in front of the unload ramp. It is much easier to reach those trails from Pioneer, which is what we'll discuss next. The Pioneer lift and pod is home to some of the most underrated intermediate and advanced skiing on the Park City side. If you're looking to get away from the crowds, this is the place to do it. We discussed the two mid-mountain runs before, but both of them lead you to this mid-mountain lodge, which is my preferred place to get lunch on the Park City side. It's relatively tucked away back here, and thus doesn't get quite as crowded as the Summit House or Miners Camp. In the upper skier's right side of the pod is Blue Slip Pole, which has a main area that's pretty steep but is just moguled and nothing too technical. That main part of the bowl is only accessible from Thaynes or Pioneer. The looker's right side of the bowl, however, is a different story. Accessible through a gate tucked behind the summit house, you can find all sorts of gnarly cliffs, rock bands, and such back here. On the looker's left side, under the lift, there is some extremely steep and technical tree skiing with some hidden cliffs. This can be accessed through a gate on Hawkeye. Hawkeye and these other two blues are some of the quietest blue cruisers anywhere on the Park City side, and I love them as such. Samson isn't typically groomed, but it does get the occasional run by the cats. In between the bowl and blues is 10th Mountain, which is home to some of the best single black tree skiing on the Mountain Village side of the resort. The runouts from Blue Slip Bowl are both typically ungroomed, while Woodside is always groomed. It does seem odd to have it as a green since it only comes from blues, but it is quite mellow and fits the bill of a green. Mid-Mountain Cutoff is quite flat and should only be used to access the lodge. Just uphill from the bottom terminal of Pioneer is the McConkey 6-pack. The bottoms of the two lifts are not right next to each other, so be sure not to accidentally ski past McConkey's and end up being forced onto Pioneer. Off the top of McConkey's, there are some absolutely fantastic panoramic views. On clear days, I would recommend all intermediates and above to head up here at least once. Intermediates can descend by taking Georgiana, which is a groomer that has some sections of road and some sections of traditional slope. Where Georgiana switches back, if you keep going, you'll end up on Tycoon, a sometimes groomed, sometimes not single black with only one truly steep pitch. That description works for all of the single blacks here, also applying to Sundog and Buckeye. McConkey's Bowl is one of the more iconic routes here, and is a super steep bumped up bowl. If you want a less steep entrance, head down Sundog a little bit before dropping in. Adjacent to the bowl is Molly's, which is home to some insanely steep tree skiing. The trees get tighter the further skiers right you go, but it also gets less steep and the snow gets better in this direction. Right at the top here, there are certain areas with small drops and straight lines if that interests you. Black Forest is similar to Molly's, but doesn't have as much technicality in its entrance. Adjacent to the groomed runout at the bottom here is Powder Monkey. This is a super fun little gully, although beware that in low light, it can be hard to spot some of the little bumps and jumps throughout. It drops you off behind McConkey's, making it difficult to get back to the maze, so I recommend saving it till your last run down so you can just go straight to Pioneer. Through a gate adjacent to the top of the lift, you can take a 15-minute hike to the top of Jupiter Peak, or shorten it to 10 minutes to the O-Zone or 5 minutes to the P-Zone. The P-Zone starts off with a big cornice, followed by some pretty technical natural obstacles. Below that, however, it turns into more traditional tree skiing. If you want to skip the upper part, you can go directly into the trees by first heading down Sundog a bit, then taking one of the lower gates. The O-Zone also has a large cornice, but is then a large bowl area. Off the summit, there are some prominent cliffs with a few chutes between. For brevity's sake, we're not going to go line by line, but I'm linking a resource below if you want to check that out for information on the individual lines. You can also head down this ridge, which then offers access to a variety of open faces and more treed areas. Over on the other side of the peak, the Jupiter lift is the most tucked away lift at Park City and has no easy routes down. This renders it much less popular than McConkey's, and it serves a good variety of terrain. If you're an expert looking to get the best of Park City, this is where it's at. To get to Jupiter, you'll take the Jupiter Access Road, and to exit, you'll take the upper part of Thaynes Canyon. Neither of these are too horribly flat, but as an alternative, you can also enter and exit by hiking up to Jupiter Peak to and from the McConkey side. You can hike up to the peak from McConkey's as previously mentioned, but many guests will find the hike from the Jupiter lift to that same summit much easier, as it is much mellower. Off of this side of Jupiter Peak, you'll have access to a plethora of lines that are, for the most part, steep open faces with trees lower down. Warzone does have some drops and straight lines at the top, while Dead Tree, West Face, and First Bowl are relatively easier. Warzone can be accessed without a hike, but the other three will require a bit of steppin'. On a powder day, I would say it's absolutely worth the hike up to these. On a standard day, it's more like 50-50 for me. The next named lines over are Indicator and Six Bells. These are extremely narrow, tree-defined chutes, and are some of the hardest lines in all of Park City. They are not signed, but you can find them by keeping an eye on your left for when the tracks really start. These are super fun runs and keep good snow because of how tucked away they are, and while they are super narrow, they're just perfectly wide enough to make turns without having to jump. To get to these, there is an initial sidestep skate just off the lift, or you can bypass this by following traverse tracks through the trees. All in this area around the two lines is some very difficult tree skiing as well, for those who aren't satisfied with the chutes. Always ski with a partner in this area. The next line over is Silver Cliffs, which is a wider chute that runs beneath the namesake Silver Cliffs on the skier's left. You can access this run by heading on the traverse tracks we just discussed, or by entering directly adjacent to the unloading ramp of the lift. The latter option will bring you out below the cliffs, onto a big mogulled area. This trio directly under the lift are by far the most popular runs. Fortune Teller has some cliffs and straight lines in its upper section that can be easily avoided. This area gets blasted by the sun and thus doesn't hold great snow. Main Bowl is the easiest way down and is exactly what it sounds like. Shadow Ridge is a more standard bump run that goes right down the ridge, although it has some cool variations if you know where to look. Everything from Indicator to Main Bowl empties into this big treed basin. At the end of the basin, when you exit the trees, have some speed because you'll have a decent little traverse to get back to the lift. If you're coming down the ridge, just stick to your left and you'll get dropped right back at the lift. There are 3 named lines on the looker's right side of the pod, and the run out from these isn't nearly as bad as that on the other side. Portuguese Gap is the first line and is easy to miss. However, if you keep a good eye out on your right, it is signed and you should be able to find it. It's not very far from the lift, despite how it looks on the map. Portuguese Gap is my favorite line in Jupiter. It's a tree chute as well and is a little bit wider than what you'll find on the other side. There are 2 paths, and I much prefer the skier's right, which is what you're seeing here. The next line over is Rhino. Rhino is this big spine from which you can head into a big bowl on the skier's left or into the trees on the skier's right. Just past Rhino is Scott's Bowl, the majority of which you'll have to hike to access. It's not worth it in my book, but to each his own. From the top of Scott's Bowl, you can continue down the ridge to one of the entrances to Pinecone Ridge, which is our final discussion point. The Pinecone Ridge terrain offers some of the most isolated backcountry-esque terrain you'll find at any Vail resort anywhere. The most efficient way to access these lines is to hike from Scott's Bowl off Jupiter for everything down to Noon Moon, and hike up from the Quicksilver Midstation for Limelight, Homelight, and Sam's Knob. All of this area offers some great variety, with trees, gullies, open faces, and more to explore. These moon runs are the best places to get some powder, and they're not that much further than lines such as Pinecone because you can ski down the main ridge from there. These are all fantastic runs, and it's absolutely worth doing a Pinecone Ridge run once. However, be warned that the nature of this terrain makes it an absolute pain for patrol, and it often only opens for a few weeks out of the season. The one line I will caution you about is Limelight, as its lower half is very rarely open, in which case you'll have to skate or walk another 5 to 10 minutes along the flat, lights-out traverse to get to some open gates. If you're going to Pinecone via the Quicksilver Gondola from the canyon side, Limelight is all you have access to, so it may be better to ride it down and then back up to get off on the other side of the midstation. Other than that, Pinecone Ridge is an area best explored, not discussed, so we'll leave it off there. Alright, that about wraps it up for the town side of Park City. A shout out to Miller Hall and Gus Batson for correctly guessing the mystery run in the California Extremes video. If you want to get shouted out just like this, keep an eye out for mystery runs and guess them in the comments. As always, please leave any questions down below. Thank you all for watching. All my love, I'm out.